So it's not that I need notes, because I could actually talk for days about this, but I'm going to throw a lot of statistics at you. So that's why I've got the paper. I just wanted you to know. This is my 5th biography, and one of the most difficult things for an author is coming up with book title, subtitle, and chapter titles. So in this case, that wasn't so hard. I decided the chapter titles first. They are Mary's own words. In 1960, Columbia University began an oral history project with her, and for the next 3 decades, they did hours and hours of recordings, which they then wisely transcribed and are available online. So even though it was nice to hear her voice, which I had done, having those words available to me to go back to made it really fun. And then I just picked out snippets and made those the chapter titles. The title of the book actually came from a letter that Dr. Sidney Farber, a well-known cancer researcher, chemotherapy researcher, sent to Mary, and he said, "This is a crusade." So that's where the title came from. But the subtitle was really hard because Mary was such a multifaceted individual. Not to mention that Albert Lasker played such an enormous place in her life. The subtitle was like 55 words, and the editor said, "No, we really need to trim that down." So it was just easiest to say The Remarkable Life, because it really was remarkable. And whether there would have been a Mary Lasker who did as much as she did without Albert Lasker, we'll never know, because fortunately the two of them met. But he certainly, and they together, certainly had a wonderful life. She was born in Watertown, Wisconsin, just a little ways up 94 and some other roads. And her father was a successful banker, and her mother was an Irish immigrant who had arrived all alone at the age of 18, but set herself up at Carson Perry Scott, and pretty soon became the head of the dressmaking department and the highest paid woman in all of Chicago. Mary went to Radcliffe and studied art history and said New York was the place she needed to go if she was going to really do something with her art career. So off she went in 1923, went to work for a gallery that was owned by a gentleman whose father had begun it. They fell in love and they got married. And part of the joy of being there were these trips they got to take to Europe on buying trips over the summers. And while he focused on the old masters, she was really into the new art, Impressionist art. And in fact, Mary Lasker brought French artist Marc Chagall to the United States for the very first time, introduced him to this country, and then later on went on to buy a lot of his paintings. Paul had one problem. Well, he had many problems, but they all stemmed from alcohol. And finally, between the market crash, the depression, and Paul's alcoholism, Mary said, I need to get out of here. And so she moved into an apartment of her own, started a really clever business. So it's the depression. Women can't afford to go shopping, but most women could sell. So she created Hollywood patterns. These are dress patterns with pictures of Fay Wray and Joan Crawford and Irene Dunn. And the idea was that if the women sewed dresses from these patterns, they could look like their favorite movie stars. And she did a really booming business. But Mary was also a networker. She loved introducing people who could value the friendship on both sides. And when it involved business deals, she wasn't shy about saying, well, I'll introduce you to him, but if something happens, I need 10%. Albert, whose story you probably know a little bit better, came from Galveston and really wanted to be a writer. He wanted to go into journalism. His father thought that was just for schlubs. He did not want Albert to be a journalist. He fixed it so that Albert would go to work for an advertising agency, and I always call it Lord and Taylor because that's the first thing that comes to mind, but that's not it. But Mr. Lord was Albert's father's friend, and Mr. Lasker Sr. said, look, just try it for a year. We've all said this to kids. Just try it for a year. If you hate it, you can quit. Well, Albert was just counting down the days till he could quit. And then he got a gambling debt. And the only way he could pay off his gambling debt was to go borrow money from his boss, and then he was an indentured servant. But over the years, he really did a lot of clever things, which is why he's known as the father of modern advertising. He made advertising have interest with graphics. It was before they could really print photography, but in the early days, he hired an artist who painted or who did sketches to put in these ads. That was unheard of. Advertising was all text. Secondly, he came up with the idea of premiums. You know, send in a label, a soup label, or 10 soup labels and get a spoon. One of his ideas, because Sunkist was one of his clients, oranges came wrapped in paper. And so if you sent in the papers from the oranges, you got something else. And in fact, Albert invented the name Sunkist, Sunsweet, Palmolive, Kleenex. These were all his inventions. He ultimately bought out that ad agency and began running his own and became a very, very wealthy man. And skipping ahead just a little bit, when he retired, he had 3 men running offices across the country. There was Emerson Foote, there was Cone here, and there was Belding in California. And those 3 men each paid $1 and got the business. And it became Foote, Cone, and Belding, which was a very large and well-respected advertising agency still in existence today. And you have an office right here in Chicago known as FBC. So I think that's kind of interesting. So anyway, Albert married Flora, and they, in 1921, launched the Lasker Foundation. It was very distressful to them to see so many people suffering, and there wasn't enough research being done. Albert was a trustee at the University of Chicago, so they thought, okay, we're going to throw some money at this, and we'll start funding research. Oh boy, did they throw money at it. They gave $1 million in seed money, which is the equivalent of $18 million today. So that was just a little startup. And while they had apartments in Chicago and New York, the thing to do as you became wealthy and became gentrified was continue moving up the lakefront. I forgot to tell you this, I grew up on the other side of the lake. I grew up on the West Coast, I always say, which is really the East Coast, but I call it the West Coast of Michigan. So anyway, coming up the lakefront, they built a house at Glencoe, but the problem was that Albert was Jewish, and he loved to golf. And being Jewish, he was not allowed entry into any golf courses. And he thought if he went a little bit further north, he'd be able to get in, and that still was the case. There was absolutely no getting in. So Albert decided to build his own, which is what he did right here in your lovely city. So he bought 480 acres from his buddy Lewis Swift, the meatpacking king, for $1,000 an acre, which is the equivalent of $17,000 an acre today. In case you're not super quick at math, that was $8.2 million in today's dollars just for the property. Then he proceeded to build a 25,000 square foot house with 56 rooms, a 100 by 40 foot swimming pool. The house construction was $3.5 million, over $56 million today, and they became the largest employers in the area. His golf course, this is the big joke, although he wasn't allowed on any of the other golf courses, his golf course was so fabulous, everyone wanted to play, everyone wanted in. And you could play, in fact there's a card right over here with the information, you could get a card and he gave you so many visits a year, and it was absolutely one of the most wonderful golf courses really in the country. Flora had had health problems since the beginning of their marriage, and she sadly died very suddenly, and Albert was devastated. But he didn't want to be alone, so what does a lonely millionaire do? Find a startup. He married Doris Kenyon, who really her only claim to fame, I think, was Mary Lasker, and they were on the dock, ready to leave on their honeymoon cruise, and he was trying to figure out how to get out of it. And after a month in Europe, they sailed back, and as soon as he got off the ship, he called his son-in-law and said, I need to stop this. So they were married less than a year. He was really distraught about it because he hated being alone, and in fact, he said, I'm going to keep marrying, I'm going to find the right woman for me if I have to marry 10 of them. Fortunately, he only had married one more. So being distraught, being in the midst of this, because Doris was no fool, she was going to take him for some money, being in the midst of this ugly divorce, he's having lunch with some of his buddies at 21 Club, a really famous lunch spot for those who, were in the social circles in those days. At a table next door was a woman called Mary Woodard, who was having lunch with a friend as well. And Mary noticed this very handsome man, and in fact she knew the two men that he was having lunch with. And this is where I think it's really interesting. As I said, this is my 5th book. My 2nd book was about a World War II spy who lost her leg in a hunting accident before World War II, and became the architect of the resistance in central France for the OSS. A man called General Bill Donovan ran the OSS. Mary knew him, and Albert knew him, and he was having lunch with Albert that day, and Donovan introduced the two. Albert was too distraught. Then they met again down in the vestibule getting ready to leave. Still, Albert's too distraught. Finally, they're out on the street, they get introduced again, and this time he looked at this woman with these gorgeous Irish eyes, and he realized she was really a catch, and then she was in the cab and gone. So he was desperate to get to meet her, which he engineered with some friends, and they had a lunch at a friend's house, but where they really spent a lot of time together was walking his property here. He said to her, you have to come to my farm, it's absolutely beautiful. By this time, he had given it to the University of Chicago, and he told them that they had 5 years to figure out what to do with it, and if they didn't, then they could break it up and sell it. But the first 2 years, he wanted to be able to, I don't know if he rented it back or borrowed it, but in any event, he wanted to be able to be here over the summer, who wouldn't? So they spent a lot of time wandering around the gardens. Her description of it is so sweet. I included it in the book, certainly. And she just thought he was marvelous. He knew about politics and business. He thought she was marvelous. She knew all about art and, as I said, this networking thing. And they were an unlikely but perfect blend. And their friends all said they're either going to kill each other or it's going to be a world-class love affair. And happily, for all of us, it was the latter. They were married in 1940, and actually the picture that's on the cover was taken the day after their wedding by a very famous British photographer. And I had seen it on the internet and really wanted to include it in the book, but of course there's that thing called rights. So I had to hunt it down, and my publisher, Clinic Press, was able to procure the rights so we could put it on the cover. But Albert he just adored her. Mary, by this time, had enough of her own money, and she made it very clear she was not going to live off his wealth. Her father, she loved her father, but he was kind of frugal, kind of miserly, and she hated the fact that her mother had to keep asking for money. So Mary was like, I don't want your money. And finally, Albert said, this is stupid. And he called her down to his office one day in New York, and he wrote her a check for $3 million. And he said, I don't care what you do with it, but this is your money, and now I don't have to feel badly about not giving you money at all. So I love my husband, he didn't do that. So the Laskers were both also very interested in the health of America. In 1940, 75% of all deaths in America were caused by cancer, heart disease, or stroke. And at that time, they separated out heart disease and stroke. When World War II started and they learned about the enlistee stats, they were more disturbed. 40% of the men who enlisted were denied because they had health issues that would either cause them further harm if they were to go into the service, or at the very least would slow them down. And so this just was not acceptable to them. And both of them really had a focus on cancer. Albert's younger brother had died of cancer, and Mary had gone with her mother at a very young age to visit the family laundress who had a mastectomy. So if Mary was born in 1899 and she was 5 or 6 years old, you can only imagine what a mastectomy in those days must have been. So cancer really became their focus, and they went to the Roosevelt Institute, now Roosevelt University in New York, to see what was being done in the way of research. And the executive director, who was their friend, said, well, really nothing. And they said, well, why isn't there any research? And he said, because no one has any good ideas. So then Mary went to the American Society for the Control of Cancer and asked them what they were doing to research. And the response was the same. We're not doing any research. Our budget is $50,000. And she said, well, what do you do with that money? And he said, well, we do a pamphlet every year on the warning signs of cancer, and so then we make more money to do the next year's pamphlet. So she gave them a $5,000 donation and huffed off saying they didn't want to cure cancer, they just wanted to control it. And they weren't doing either very well. So Albert and she decided that they needed to come up with a way to help young researchers. Albert wanted to find research bargains, he called them. And the way to do that was to start another Lasker Foundation, only this one he insisted be called the Albert and Mary Lasker Foundation. And then in 1942, they began making $1,000 prizes available to researchers. That foundation is still in existence, although today the prizes are $250,000. And they award them at a very fancy annual luncheon, which I was invited to a couple weeks ago. It was really exciting. I felt like Dorothy out of Oz. And they're known as the American Nobels because so many of the recipients have gone on to win Nobel Prizes. In 1942, Albert was really tired of the advertising business, and he just decided it was time to get out, which is when he sold it for $1 to Foote Conan Building. And he realized that while it had taken up a great deal of his life, and he'd been very successful, he didn't feel that he'd given his wife and children the kind of attention they deserved, and he felt guilty about that. But ultimately, he made peace with himself. Somebody asked him once if he missed advertising, and he said, the Lasker of the advertising business, the advertising world, died in 1942. I never think of him, and I'm not sure I even knew the man. And I think that's really telling also about their relationship and how much fun they had. So Albert's money and enthusiasm allowed Mary to pursue her work, and her love for him gave him a new purpose. So Mary was really into art collecting, and she kept a couple of the pieces that she had when she was married to her first husband. And one day she was reading the newspaper, and there was this obscure little auction coming up at a small gallery for one of Renoir's paintings, Fleur de Chat, which is flowers and cats. And she said, I'm gonna go and see if I can get that. Well, Albert really he kept saying he didn't understand art. And she finally convinced him that there was no understanding. Either you look at a piece and it speaks to you and you like it, or it doesn't. And that's okay. You don't have to understand anything. You can learn more about the artist and the technique, but that's not really what art appreciation is. So she said to him, come with me to this auction. He's like, no, I don't want to go. And she said, oh, come on, it'll be fun. So they could walk to Fifth Avenue into the gallery. He said, I'll just wait out in the lobby. And she said, no, come inside with me. So there were no two seats together, and nobody put bookmarks on the chairs. And so he sat in the back, and she sat toward the front. So she had decided that her max was going to be $10,000, which is $175,000 today. And so she bid up to her $10,000, and she was bidding against a gallery owner in the room who was going to buy it and take it over to his own gallery. And when she got to the $10,000, she stopped. The next voice she heard was Albert's, and he bid up to $25,000, which is the equivalent of $436,000 today. He lost out. He got scared, and he quit bidding, and the gallery owner got it and took down the street to his gallery. So they lived in a very big, beautiful, 7-story 7-story, actually, townhouse in New York City. And not long after that, Albert said, you know, we have a lot of empty walls. I'll be back. And he put his hat on his head and marched out. And he came back with not only Fleur et Chat, but 2 other paintings as well. He paid $105,000 for the Renoir, which is $1.8 million. And Mary said, in light of present prices, which, you know, that was 30 years ago when she said that. So in light of present prices, it was one of the greatest bargains in the world. Then there was the time that they didn't agree on art. Still Life with Fishes, Picasso painted, and Mary bought it and had it delivered to their house, because now Albert was on board with this art stuff. He hated it. He hung it in a hallway where no one could see it, and he even went so far as to write a note on the back that he taped to the back. This picture belongs to Mary Lasker and is not to be thought of as part of the Albert Lasker collection. The third and one of my favorite stories was about a painting done just a few months before Van Gogh died. Van Gogh did it just a few months before he died, called White Roses, or in French, Les Roses. There were 2 of them, actually. There was a horizontal one and a vertical one. So it had fallen into Nazi hands. It was owned by a German Jewish family, and it had fallen into Nazi hands, but it finally found its way back to the owner's family, and it was in a vault in New York City. Albert was out in Palm Springs and called Mary, who was in New York, and said, listen, you've got to go down to such and such a bank. They're going to pull the picture out, and you need to buy it. Well, she had an appointment with President Truman, because by this time she was a very active citizen lobbyist. And she said, Albert, I can't possibly. I'm taking the train to Washington, D.C. I'm meeting with the president, and I'm meeting, going to the National Advisory Heart Council meeting. And so I'll just get it when I get back. And he was beside himself. She came back from her meetings, went to the bank, and it had been sold. So it had been sold for $100,000, $1 million today. With the help of her stepson-in-law, she bought it back from another owner. Bought it back for $135,000, $1.6 million. And Albert laughed about it later and said Mary's 5-hour trip to Washington, D.C. cost him $7,000 an hour, which is $82,000 today's money. But ultimately, their collection was more than 200 pieces of art. And it was very instrumental in what came next and in addition to their life. Albert said, you know, we can raise money all we want to help these organizations, but the real money is going to come from the U.S. government. He had been head of the shipping board under President Harding, so he knew how government worked. He knew how Congress worked. And he said, we need to go to the government for money, and I'll show you how to do it. So he taught her how to fundraise in order to friend raise. They would get all their rich buddies together. They would talk them into donating to senators and congressmen who were sympathetic to the medical research cause. And then those same senators and congressmen would see to it that medical research kept marching forward. But when Mary started in 1942-43, medical research funding was almost at a standstill in this country, as I explained. Doctors were actually going to Europe to be trained and to do research because none was being done here. And so she just started meeting with congressmen and senators. She had absolutely no qualms about that whatsoever. She had a friend about whom another biography, after you buy and read mine, the second book you have to read is a book called The Confidant about Anna Rosenberg. Anna was in FDR's White House, and she was really another woman who broke glass ceilings. So Anna, buddy of Albert and Mary's, introduced Mary to the Roosevelts, and they were just the first family that Mary got to be friends with. So she started meeting with these politicians and talking to them about the need for medical research. But Albert gave her a really powerful tool, and that is putting her request into terms that people could understand. She explained that for every person who couldn't work because they had a cancer diagnosis and maybe even died, that was X amount of money out out of the economy. And then if you multiply that by the number of people who were being diagnosed with cancer and dying of it, or heart disease, or stroke, this is the big number that's coming out of the economy, and that got the politicians' attention. Disease and illness does not fall on political lines. Republicans and Democrats get sick equally. And she almost got thrown out, in fact, almost physically thrown out. She did get thrown out, but almost physically thrown out of a senator's office one day. And 2 weeks later, he called her and asked her to come back. And he was very contrite and said, I'm very sorry for the way I treated you. You're absolutely right. We need to understand this cancer thing much better. And she said, I don't understand. What changed your mind? And he said, my mother was diagnosed with cancer last week. And that really made Mary realize that it was personal and it really needed to change. So when she started, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, was a single institute. It had the National Cancer Institute, but that was just sort of an appendage. It wasn't even considered an independent institute. So Mary and another gal pal who was also very interested in medical research, they just started their lobbying and started hounding these people to create other institutes for other diseases. And they were so excited because, ironically, the first institute that they got approval for was the Mental Health Institute. And they thought, wow, now NIH can be plural. And they were asked, well, how much was appropriated? And they said, well, $5 million. And the person said, no, that's how much was approved. Now we have to start over again and go through appropriations to actually get that money. So the research for this book really taught me a lot about that process, and I much better understand why we can't get anything done. So eventually, more and more institutes were added and appropriated for. There was heart and lung, there was cancer, then became its own institute. There was the Eye Institute, there was the Institute for Infectious Diseases, and those all have Mary Lasker's fingerprints on it. She was absolutely adamant that there must be a simple doctor who can give a simple pill to a suffering patient. Those were her words. She wanted a cure for the disease. And she knew we were just around the corner, and that's all she kept talking about was the cure. Albert was 21 years older than Mary, and he, in 1950, was having abdominal distress, and ultimately had surgery, and a cancerous tumor was removed. And it was never described as any particular kind of cancer. It was just, in everything I read, it was called abdominal cancer. And he was fine. And so in addition to, by this time, Mill Road Farm was no longer in their hands, nor was the University of Chicago doing anything with it, but they had gotten another farm in Amenia in upstate New York, because that was their summer home since they lived in New York. So he was having so much fun on his farm. He had his 70th birthday party in Paris. They were good friends with lots of celebrities, but Danny Thomas and his wife were very dear friends. And the head curator of Versailles actually showed them how to get out on the roof of Versailles. Danny and Albert and the curator, and the three of them sat out there and drank wine and looked out at the gardens. I mean, these stories are just, oh my gosh, they were just wonderful. Albert's intestinal distress came back after that trip, and he thought maybe it was too much drinking and eating, and ultimately he had surgery again, and the cancer was back. In those days, you didn't talk about cancer because there was very little that could be done. In fact, really only 1 in 4 people were ever cured. Now we don't even say cure, we just say you're dead. You have no evidence of disease, and that's where you want to be. So they decided, since there was really nothing beyond the surgery that could be done, and because lymph nodes were involved, that it wasn't going to be good. And they just chose not to tell. And whether he ever knew that he had cancer is hard to tell. But on Memorial Day, actually the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend in 1952, he died. Mary's oral history was very stoic, as society women of those days typically were. And so in speaking about Albert's death, she said she was devastated, and she was really lost, and she took her usual trip to France over the summer, and then she came back with a vengeance. She doubled down. Now she was really going to see to it that cancer was cured. So again, more and more funding, more research projects. And what she realized was happening for the National Cancer Institute, because it was beneath NIH, which was a part of the Public Health Service, which was a part of what we now call, it was Health, Education, and Welfare at that time. Somebody help me, what is it now? HHS, that's it. So it was under all those layers and layers of bureaucracy. Nothing could move forward without tons and tons of paperwork, even after they got the money. In fact, the National Cancer Institute director said he was so frustrated he would find a scientist and offer the guy, and the guy was interested in working, and so then he'd go back to get this guy's, or because they were almost always guys, get this guy's salary approved, and a month later, the guy moved on because he needed a job. And this was just infuriating Mary. She was very good friends, mentioned her seeing Truman. She was really good friends with the Kennedys. Rose Kennedy was about her same age, and she got to know Jack and Jackie really well. And in fact, she gave Jackie Kennedy her first donation for the White House project. She gave Jackie Kennedy $10,000 to add to begin the White House renovation. And so she said to President Kennedy, you know, I think if we came up with a commission for cancer, that we could really get some work done. But I think since heart attack and stroke kind of are rolled into this, and since your father has just had a stroke, what do you think? Why don't we do this commission? And Kennedy said, that's great. And as soon as I get back from Dallas, we'll get to work on it. And that didn't happen. Johnson was insistent that all of the programs that Kennedy started, he wanted to pick up. And Mary's, of course, was one of them. And Mary knew Johnson as one of the senators, one of the senior senators that she lobbied. Plus, she got to know Lady Bird really well. Lady Bird became one of her best friends. So they went to the funeral, and then they had given Jackie and the kids some time to move out of the White House. Mary was the first guest that the Johnsons had at the White House, and she had come to help Lady Bird hang paintings and take the knickknacks and furniture out of their house in Washington to move to the White House. So anyway, so she said to Johnson not long after that, well, the president was working on this, and I think we should carry this further. They did, although what ended up being the bill was not exactly what Mary had hoped for. And the money ended up being spent more on regional medical facilities rather than the nitty-gritty research. She had a huge enemy in the American Medical Association, because anytime you talked about giving money to doctors or to medicine or to research, everybody was like, oh, this is socialized medicine. We just saw this happen in Nazi Germany, where all of the German doctors were told what to research and what they couldn't research. We're not doing this. It was a huge uphill battle. So it was kind of back to the drawing board. And then, of course, Johnson surprised everybody by saying, I shall not seek nor shall I accept nomination for President of the United States. And Mary said, when Nixon was nominated, that he would be, wait for it, he would be a disaster of unparalleled proportions. And of course, the disaster got to the White House. So after enjoying kind of a good run with the Kennedys and the Johnsons, now there was a Republican back in the White House, and Republicans' focus is different, although, again, I repeat, everybody knows somebody who had cancer, and in Nixon's case, it was a much beloved aunt. So he was not unsympathetic to the cause. Mary envisioned, and actually had shared this with Johnson in his last months at the White House, she envisioned a NASA kind of organization for cancer research. Something that was completely independent of any other agency in the country. That's what NASA is. It doesn't answer to anybody except the president. And she said to Johnson, if we're exploring outer space, because Kennedy wanted to land a man on the moon before the decade was out, if we're exploring outer space, why don't we explore inner space and create a NASA-like organization? So this was the plan she was now going to have to get President Nixon to agree to. So again, she creates this commission. She was always really smart. Her commissions always included men and women, doctors and lay people, Democrats and Republicans. And Nixon's second father, Elmer Bosk, was on this committee, and he was a good friend of Mary's. In fact, Elmer Bosk was the only friend Nixon and Mary had in common. And they got this commission rolling. They seated a group of researchers and doctors who came up with a plan to create an institute or an organization outside of NIH to research cancer. And they asked for an unbelievable amount of money. They asked for a number of other things, the most important of which Mary had already established, was that each institute needed an advisory board that also was made up of lay people and doctors. So they wanted all of this for cancer. And of course, the people at NIH were freaking out because they couldn't possibly take the National Cancer Institute away. The political intrigue was amazing to research. And remember, Nixon left a lot of tapes, and a lot of those tapes are online. So I heard him talking about this stuff. So here comes 1970. Mary's still adamant that we're going to cure cancer. 1971. Nixon is looking ahead at 1972. He was so paranoid that everyone was against him. He did not want to run against another Kennedy. Kennedy did not want to run for president. He'd seen his brothers killed. He was responsible for his brother's children. He wanted nothing to do with it. And every time an article came out about putting his name forward for nomination, he went up in the polls. Nixon went on a drinking binge. It was a nightmare. But Kennedy needed to bury something from his past. He wanted redemption for Chappaquiddick. So here's this cancer thing. If Kennedy, who is now on the health subcommittee in the Senate, if he could push through some really grand cancer bill and infuse a lot of money into research that would save lots of lives, man, nobody would remember Chappaquiddick. Nixon, wanting to be elected, man, if he was the cancer curer-in-chief, everybody would remember him as that. And again, Mary just wanted to cure cancer. But the three of them made it all the way through a big struggle to December 23rd, 1971, when Nixon signed the National Cancer Act. And he said that this could possibly be the greatest thing this administration ever does. And kind of it was. Because after that, things went south for Nixon. But he was still adamant about getting Ted Kennedy. And the funny part about that is that there's a tape. As soon as this big White House ceremony is over, it's the Christmas present to the nation. As soon as it was over, he went to his office and called in Chuck Colson, which was kind of his right-hand guy. And the tape says, now we gotta get that Ted Kennedy. After all of that, it was an amazing part to write. And after all of that, Mary said about Nixon that he might actually turn out to be the most sympathetic president this country had ever had. The last little story I want to share with you about Mary, the Crusade continued. The National Cancer Act, by the way, did not remove National Cancer Institute from NIH, but it does answer directly to the president. It infused $1.8 billion into research, which was unheard of. That's in excess of $11 billion today. And I really think that every research breakthrough since then has stemmed from that. There was about a century ago, there was a scientist whose name escapes me, who said, if I've done great things, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. And I really think that's what happened with research after the Cancer Act. So Mary continued lobbying for more money, lobbying for better research, and she got very clever about her entertaining. She loved to entertain. So she would have dinner parties with four chairs at each table. And she would seat a celebrity, a politician, a journalist, and a scientist. So the the journalist was there hoping to get some kind of a scoop from the celebrity. The politician was hoping that the journalist would publicize whatever his most recent successes were. The scientist was told by Mary just to cater to only a very important person at the table, which was the politician. And every single dinner party had this recipe, and it worked because she kept getting more and more research funded. She also sold some of her artwork, not only to keep the Lasker Foundation rolling, but do you remember interferon? It was in the 80s. They called it the big if in cancer. And it's a blood product, but you have to run the blood through a centrifuge a bunch of times. It's extremely expensive and difficult to get. She sold a clump of paintings to the tune of about $4 million in order to fund interferon research. When she died in 1994, by the time she died in 1994, her research efforts probably touched every person in the country. And I'm often asked by journalists at the end of, or by interviews, at the end of my interviews, what I hope people will get out of this book. And my answer is always the same. Margaret Mead was a cultural anthropologist who actually died of cancer. But her quote is one of my very favorites, and that is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, concerned citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And that certainly was Mary Lasker, and she was certainly deserving of this book. Thank you very much. So what do you want to know? How long did it take me to research and write? Okay, that's not a lot. And it's kind of, it's kind of, I would say it's like a romantic relationship. You really have to love what you're doing because you're going to spend about 2 years with it, sometimes more. But I churn a book out about every 2 years. And as soon as the final manuscript goes off to the editor, then in addition to marketing that book, I have to start on the next one as well. And I'm getting older, so I gotta write faster. But seriously, can I answer? Yes.
How did you get hooked up with Mayo Clinic?
So, did everybody hear that? How did I get hooked up with Mayo Clinic? So I have a wonderful, bright agent, and I didn't even know Mayo Clinic had a publishing arm. Not many people did. And so she sent my proposal to Mayo Clinic, and on the day that we got their offer, we got 2 other offers as well, but Mayo decided that they wanted to, that they have books about kale recipes and books about how to care for your liver and things like that, but they decided they wanted to start adding proper biographies. So they hired a very well-respected editor from New York City, who my agent wrote to, and that editor wanted some really strong biographies, and mine crossed her desk, and so the stars aligned. And they also bought my next book, so that's pretty big. Pretty excited about that. When you write nonfiction, it's sold by proposal rather than by manuscript, so you have to outline it, you do a chapter, a couple sample chapters, you do, the table of contents, and a number of other supporting documents before you start writing. So that's why she sent out a proposal. But that's a good question. So mine is their first biography. Besides, actually, they have one of the Mayo brothers, but they wrote it in his house. Yes, I really love their scarf.
Oh, thank you. Got it in Germany.
Oh, I love it. I wonder
I
if she...
found it in my sister's house after about 12 years. Thank you. What were you doing before you did this, or were you always involved in writing about research?
So I have been did. I mean, people think this is made up, but there was an old maple tree in my parents' backyard in Michigan, and I would sit up in that maple tree and write poetry and short stories. It was the late 60s, there was a lot of teenage angst going on, you know, stuff. I still have the notebook, it's pretty funny. But,
You weren't around in the 60s.
oh, yes, ma'am. And so it was during the Vietnam War, my friends were being shipped off, so I started writing then. But I was a French teacher out of college, and then I went into advertising, and then I went into radio, and then I married an orthodontist, and he said, you know, I really like it if you didn't have to spend as much time working, and I said, so would I. I've always wanted to write, so I started writing, and I wanted to be the next Sue Grafton, the next great novelist, and I discovered a really amazing story about a man who was one of the first prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army in the Philippines during World War II, and that became my first biography. And then I wrote about a spy who was a woman, an American woman, who became the architect of the resistance in central France, and she only had one leg. She lost her leg before the war in a hunting accident. So that was book 2. And then I was about to start book 3, trying to figure out what book 3 was going to be, because sometimes there's lots of hits and misses. You come up with ideas, and your agent says, no, that's not really a book, or there's not enough material. And then I got cancer. So I took a year off, and because you can't think very well going through that, and then still couldn't find the next story, so I started a little nonprofit in Arizona and met the woman who became the inspiration of my last book. But I also wrote a little book while I was going through cancer. And in that book, it's called From Shadows to Life, the first chapter I had to research Mary Lasker, because she makes an appearance in the first chapter. I kind of channeled George Lucas, you know how he wrote Star Wars, like all choppy, like there was the 3rd one, and then there was the 5th one, and then there was the 1st one. That was me. I wrote the sequel to the Mary Lasker book first, and then this book is really the prequel. But I love to write. It's my favorite thing to do. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
What is the background of the picture of Mary with the horses?
So she and her friend, Florence, decided for whatever reason that Albert went to Tucson a couple of times just to relax. You know, he had this high-pressure job, and he was, I think he was probably what we would call today bipolar. Or manic, sort of. You know, he'd be high, he'd be low, he'd be high, he'd be low. So he would go to Tucson to sort of relax. And Mary got the idea that, with Florence, that they should go find some property and buy a ranch. And so they did. There's another really great picture of Albert with the cowboy hat on. But that one is Mary on her ranch with horses. And they didn't go very often, sadly. And in fact, because I live in Phoenix, after I discovered this, I said to my husband, okay, we gotta go find a ranch. And so we drove to, I knew the town, which is nothing but a crossroad, and we couldn't find any ranch, but I found an old man working in a barn, and so I walked in and said, hey, I'm looking for, I can't remember what the name of the farm, or the ranch was, Double Z, I think. And he's like, no, you know that. So when I threw the last name out, he didn't know that, and so I never did find it, but that's in Arizona. Anything else?
What's your next book?
So this is one of those, I don't have a subtitle yet, so kind of roll with me when I explain it, but the working title is really cool. It's called Radical Sisters, and it's the history of the women's health revolution. And it spans the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I didn't even know there was a revolution. I would have gotten more active in it. Roe v. Wade occurred in the 70s, but that's all that anyone really can pinpoint as something that happened. There was a great deal that went on in women's health. And the most poignant of all is the way breast cancer was treated. And so, here's the subtitle. Shirley Temple Black, a woman called Rose Kushner, who you've probably never heard of, and Evelyn Lauder, who's Estee Lauder's daughter-in-law. Each of them had breast cancer in a different decade, and each of them, unbeknownst to the others, used their breast cancer, well, the others knew about it, but they used their breast cancer to further women's health. So in the 70s, up until really the early 80s, if you had a lump in your breast, the doctor said, I'm sure it's nothing, I'm just going to do a biopsy. And if they found cancer, they just amputated your breast. Without your approval, you still got without a breast. That was called the one-step procedure. And Shirley said, the doctor can make the incision, but I'm going to make the decision. And she was also really big on self-exams. She did, so in those days they kept people in the hospital for women for a week. She did after a mastectomy, about 4 days after her surgery, she did a presser. She had the press come in her hospital room. She had Gardine in her hair. She was so cute, and talked about, you know, how important it is that women do this. Rose was the one who really got a lot done in terms of women's health and making people understand that we're not just small men, that we have all kinds of other differences that need to be taken into account. And then Evelyn, with her friend Alexandra Penny, created the Pink Ribbon and Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So that's the subtitle. Yes.
Those decades that you just mentioned, I remember when I was young, just had a baby, and someone, I think in the hospital, introduced me to a book called Our Bodies Ourselves.
Yes.
So is that part of the?
That's huge.
literature?
Yeah.
And then since then, I've gotten a rewrite of it, but a lot of stuff is different.
Yeah.
In there before. But that's an amazing, amazing book for any woman, young, middle-aged, and older.
Yeah.
Covers every aspect of your health, mental well-being, and handicaps and relationships.
And some of the women who were involved in putting that together when they were organizing early on, they were put in jail for printing materials about women's bodies, for talking about women's bodies in public. They had to meet in little tiny, yeah. I mean, it was like the suffragettes all over again. It was really crazy. It's hard to believe. It really is. Anything else? Thank you so much for coming.